I knew something was wrong the instant the sky changed colour. It was subtle at first, a faint shimmer through the morning haze, but it was enough to make me tighten my grip on the control stick. My name is Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, 23 years old, 89th Fighter Squadron, the Burma Banshees, and on the morning of December 13th, 1943, I was the only man in the air over Assam, India. I was flying a routine patrol, the kind of quiet circuit you can almost do by feel, listening to the steady hum of my P-40 Warhawk and watching the pale sun push through the mist. Nothing about the first few minutes suggested the world was about to drop out from under me, but at exactly 9:27 a.m, as I banked east in a gentle climbing turn, I saw movement, too much of it too fast, breaking through the thin curtain of fog about 3 miles ahead. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, the kind of distortion that sometimes dances above the tree line at that hour. Then the shapes sharpened, one after another, until there were dozens of them, layered like dark scales across the sky. I counted as fast as my mind would allow. I didn't reach 10 before I knew this wasn't a small strike force, and by the time I reached 24, I realised I was staring at a full formation of Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers. But what froze my breath wasn't the bombers, it was everything moving above and below them. Around 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, fanned out in protective layers, escorting the bombers in a formation so tight and organised it looked like a single machine made of wings, engines and death. 64 Japanese aircraft in total. 64. All headed straight for Denyon Airfield. For a moment all I could do was stare. The sky to the east flickered with their engine flashes, the morning light glinting off canopies and wings, and for a heartbeat I felt like I was standing on a railroad track with a freight train bearing down on me. I'd flown 43 combat missions before that morning, enough to know what a raid typically looked like, enough to sense when something was routine and when something was designed to crush everything in its path. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a killing blow, aimed straight at the heart of our operations in northeast India, and I was the only American pilot in the air to see it coming. Shock gave way to a cold, steady realization. No matter what I did next, I was already living on borrowed time. As I steadied Lulubelle's wings and watched that vast formation move closer with every passing second, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. This was the morning I shouldn't have survived. As I watched that massive Japanese formation push toward Denyon, the first thing that hit me wasn't fear. It was the cold understanding of what waited directly beneath their flight path. For 8 long weeks before this morning, our airfields across northeast India had taken blow after blow. 47 transport aircraft destroyed on the ground. 112 men killed without ever getting the chance to fight back. Every pilot in the Burma Banshees carried those numbers like weight in the chest. And as I looked down at Denyon Airfield, I knew exactly what was at stake if this raid reached its target untouched. That field wasn't just a strip of dirt and steel, it was a lifeline. 14 C-47s sat parked in neat rows, their bellies filled with critical supplies headed for Chiang Kai-shek's forces across the hump. Lose those aircraft, and we wouldn't just lose equipment, we'd choke off China's ability to stay in the fight. Beside them, in a cluster of tents and makeshift boards, a field hospital held 63 wounded men. Some could barely walk, some couldn't stand at all, and not one of them had any way to run if bombs started falling. Just beyond the hospital were the fuel stocks, enough to keep hump operations going for 11 days. 11 days may not sound like much, but in this theatre it was everything. Without that fuel, the transports couldn't climb over the Himalayas. Supplies wouldn't reach the Chinese front. The entire CBI chain would begin to collapse piece by piece, until nothing was left holding the line. And there I was, alone in the sky, knowing the nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away at Yorhat. 38 minutes we didn't have. The Japanese bombers were already closing fast, barely 20 miles from their release point. At that speed, they'd be over Denyon in only a few minutes. No warning, no defence, no chance for anyone on the ground to do more than look up and wait for the blast. The weight of that reality settled in my stomach. I thought about the C-47 crews who had loaded their supplies through the night. I thought about the wounded men lying in that hospital tent, listening to the engines overhead and hoping they weren't hearing their last warning. And I thought about the hump, the lifeline we were risking everything to keep open. If I turned away now, if I waited for reinforcements to arrive, The bombers would roll in untouched and turn Denjan into a funeral pyre. I wasn't thinking about glory. I wasn't thinking about odds. I was thinking about what would happen if those 80-plus tons of Japanese ordnance hit the ground with no one to stop them. And the only conclusion left standing was harsh and simple. If they reached that airfield without opposition, everything beneath me would burn. Before I made my move, I forced myself to look down at the worn metal around me, reminding myself of exactly what I had to fight with. My P-40N carried the name Lulu Bell painted beneath the cockpit, along with the big white number 44 on her side, and even though she wasn't the fastest or flashiest fighter in the theatre, she had saved my skin more than once. She was tough, heavy, and honest, a machine that rewarded a steady hand and punished every mistake. Her firepower came from 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, with just enough ammunition for about 12 seconds of continuous fire if I held the triggers down, which meant every burst had to count. My fuel gauges showed full internal tanks, around 180 gallons, good for roughly 90 minutes of combat power before the Allison engine began running hot and hungry. Above all, I knew my position mattered. I sat about 3,000 feet higher than the bomber stream, and they were moving north at around 240 miles per hour. That difference in altitude and angle gave me the only real advantage I had, speed in the dive and the element of surprise. But even with those numbers working in my favour, the logic in every training manual told me what I was supposed to do. When you're outnumbered more than 5 to 1, doctrine says you wait for reinforcements, keep your distance, shadow the enemy formation, and attack only when help arrives. It's a good rule on paper. It keeps pilots alive. It preserves aircraft for the next mission. But there was nothing in those pages about what to do when waiting meant watching 63 wounded men on the ground die before help could get there. There was no paragraph explaining what to do when the field below you held the only aircraft keeping the hump airlift alive. Doctrine didn't see the stakes. I did. I remember taking one slow breath, letting the truth settle in. If I followed the book, I would survive, but the men depending on that airfield wouldn't. If I broke from the book, I might not live long enough to regret it. Somewhere between those two thoughts, the choice stopped being a choice. I wrapped my hand around the throttle and felt the familiar resistance as I pushed it forward, watching the manifold pressure climb to 54 inches. The Allison engine roared, deep and confident, and Lulu Bell surged ahead with a strength that felt almost personal. My airspeed jumped toward 320 miles per hour as I positioned myself to the south of the formation, keeping the sun behind my canopy so its glare would hide my approach. With the nose pointed down and the world rushing up toward me, I understood exactly what I was committing to. 1 Warhawk, 1 pilot, and no turning back. And with that, I began my dive for the first pass. I knew that if I didn't break the lead bombers right away, nothing else I did that morning would matter, so I set Lulu Bell on a line that would put me high above their left flank. The 6 Sallies in front were arranged in 2 tight V formations, steady and disciplined, holding their altitude like they were riding on invisible rails. From where I sat, they looked almost peaceful, but I knew the destruction they carried inside their bays. I rolled the Warhawk inverted, letting the world flip upside down, and the moment my nose dipped toward the bomber stream, gravity grabbed hold of me like a hand pressing down on my chest. The dive steepened, the air rushed past the canopy in a rising howl, and the Allison engine began to scream at full power as my speed climbed past 360 miles an hour. The view through the windscreen narrowed into a tunnel, 6 dark shapes growing larger with every heartbeat, and all the noise in the world seemed to fade under the simple fact that I had one chance to make this pass count. At around 800 yards, I steadied my sight on the lead Sally's left wing and squeezed the trigger. The 650s hammered the nose of the P-40 so hard I could feel the vibration in my elbows, and bright red tracers leapt forward in long, deadly arcs. They walked across the bomber's wing just the way training said they should. First fabric tearing, then flashes of metal, then sparks, and a moment later the port engine erupted in a burst of orange flame. Thick black smoke poured backward, spilling into the slipstream, and the bomber wobbled like it had been punched in the gut. Before I even closed the distance, the entire formation began to unravel. The left element pulled wide to avoid the burning Sally, the right element broke hard in the opposite direction, and the perfect symmetry they'd held just seconds earlier dissolved into a mess of wings sliding away from each other. their accuracy, everything that made them deadly was gone in an instant. I pulled back on the stick as hard as I dared, and the Warhawk surged upward under a crushing 7 Gs that made the edges of my vision go dark. For a moment I couldn't tell where the horizon was. I only knew I needed altitude before their escorts realised what had just happened. When the darkness cleared, I levelled the wings and glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of fighters above the bombers, peeling off and angling down toward me, sunlight flashing off their wings like a shower of steel. It hit me then, sharp and cold. The sallies were only the opening act. What came next, the screen of fighters diving to cut me apart, was the part of the morning where I could actually die. The moment the sally formation blew apart under my first pass, I knew the next threat would come fast and hard, and it did. The Oscars dropped in from above like hawks that had finally spotted the one rabbit foolish enough to run in open ground. Anyone who has ever flown against a Nakajima Ki-43 knows exactly why they were feared. They were powered by the HA-115 engine, putting out around 150 horsepower, light on the controls, and able to reach nearly 329 miles an hour at around 13,000 feet. But more than speed or horsepower, it was their turn radius that made them deadly. With those butterfly combat flaps, an Oscar could bleed just enough speed to swing tighter than almost anything we had, circling like it was nailed to the centre of the sky. My P-40N was different. She had a V17 10R81 engine, making about 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, and she could hit 378 miles an hour below 12,000 feet. Straight ahead, Lulu Bell could run with the best of them, but she was heavier, and every time I pulled her into a sustained turn, I could feel the weight dragging energy away, the nose fighting to stay up, the airframe pushing back at me. Every training lecture we ever heard hammered one point home: never turn with an Oscar, hit and run, extend and reset. That was the rule. That was the smart way. But this wasn't a morning for smart. If I extended away, if I used speed to get out clean, the bombers would use that breathing room to tighten back into their Vs and head straight for Denyan. I didn't have the luxury of flying by the book. The first 4 Oscars came at me from my 10 o'clock high, slanting down in a loose finger 4. I pulled the nose up, squeezed off a 2-second burst, and watched the tracers walk high and miss. They broke right in perfect coordination, clean as a knife edge, their wingmen following like shadows. I rolled left and dove to keep my speed, only to see 2 more Oscars slicing down from above. I fired again, adjusting a split second too late, and the rounds streaked past empty sky. My ammo counter reminded me I had roughly 800 rounds left. Maybe 6 good attacks if I fired clean and didn't waste a single burst. Through the shifting curtain of fighters, I caught a glimpse of the sallies trying to reform, 3 separate groups of 6 struggling to tighten back into their bombing Vs. They were still heading for the field, still committed, still deadly. I looked at the distance they were covering, did the math in my head, and felt the urgency hit like a punch. I had maybe 90 seconds before they reached the point where they could drop their loads with lethal effect. 90 seconds before everything below me was pulled into the fire. The Oscars tightening above me were dangerous, yes, but the real danger was still ahead, trying hard to rebuild itself, and I knew I had to stop it. I knew I had only seconds to act before the bombers slipped back into a clean formation, so I rolled out of the last turn, shoved the throttle all the way forward, and let Lulu Bell drop into another dive that pressed me into the seat. The air around the canopy blurred as my speed climbed past 350, then 380, and finally touched 405 miles per hour, a number you could feel more than read because the whole airframe trembled like it was straining to outrun the world. 8 Oscars threw themselves after me, but sheer gravity and the Warhawk's weight gave me the edge in this kind of dive. They simply couldn't keep up. Their shapes shrank in my mirrors, while the bomber stream grew large and solid below. When I levelled out at their altitude, the right-hand group of sallies was directly ahead, 6 of them trying to settle back into 2 tight Vs like nothing had happened moments earlier. I lined up on the lead bomber at roughly 300 yards, steadied my breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The 650s answered with a deep, shaking roar, and the tracers walked across the sky toward the right engine of the lead sally. A heartbeat later, the HA-101 radial blew apart in a fireball so bright it flashed through the smoke streaks, and the bomber rolled sharply away trailing sheets of flame. Its wingman yanked hard to avoid the burning wreck, breaking their formation before it even had a chance to settle. I kicked left rudder, let the nose skid across the sky in a side slip, and caught another sally in my sights. This time my rounds punched straight through its thin fuselage skin. No armour, no self-sealing tanks, nothing but fabric and metal designed back in 1936 when no one imagined a bomber would face heavy American machine guns head-on. The second sally lurched, wobbled, and then dropped out of its slot as fuel mist sprayed through the holes my bullets left behind. And just like that, the bomber formation shattered again. Instead of one coordinated strike group, I saw them peel off in 3 different directions, scattering across the sky like a flock of birds startled into flight. They could still release their bombs, yes, but without a tight V their accuracy was gone. Whatever fell now would land miles apart, lost to the jungle instead of hammering Denyon airfield. I took a quick glance at my gauges. Fuel down to 162 gallons, ammunition about 650 rounds, then checked the distance to the target. 19 miles, 4 minutes, maybe a little less, before they reached drop range. For one brief moment I let myself believe the worst might be behind me, that maybe breaking them twice was enough. But then I noticed a flicker on the edge of the instrument panel, a heat needle creeping higher than it should. It was small, almost easy to ignore in the chaos, but deep down I knew what it meant. The engine was starting to feel the strain, and the real fight was about to begin. As I climbed back into position for another attack run, I finally felt the first real sign that my luck was running out. The Allison V1710 beneath my feet began to run hotter than it ever should. The P-40's liquid-cooled engine depended on coolant circulating through the cylinder heads in the block, carrying heat down to the radiator tucked beneath the belly. And I knew from training that once you pushed the manifold pressure past 50 inches, the heat rose fast. Too fast. The system was built to handle about 20 minutes of strain like that, and I had already spent 11 of them holding the throttle wide open. When I glanced at the gauge and saw the needle sitting at 230 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 above normal and creeping toward the danger line at 250, I felt a different kind of pressure settle in my chest. The sky around me was still alive with fighters, but the worst fight I was facing now was inside the cowling. I had 3 choices, and none of them were good. I could ease the throttle back and let the engine cool, and in doing so give the bombers the chance to regroup and strike the airfield unopposed. I could break off entirely and head for home, knowing full well that turning away meant leaving Denyon to burn. Or I could keep the throttle forward, drive the Allison past the point of reason, and accept the very real risk that the engine would die over hostile jungle with no friendly help anywhere near me. In the end, the decision didn't feel heroic. It just felt necessary. I kept the throttle where it was. Almost immediately, 2 Oscars came straight at me in a head-on pass, closing at more than 600 miles per hour. Their 7.7mm tracers glared bright against the sky as they reached for my nose, and I answered with my 50s, feeling the guns hammer through the airframe. At 350 yards, I saw my rounds bite into the left Oscar's engine cowling, tearing it open and sending a white plume of coolant vapour streaming behind it. Its wingman followed it out of the fight, and I rolled off to the right, feeling the heat inside my own engine continue to build. The gauge slid past 240 degrees now, close to the point where the coolant would begin to boil, and the metal inside the cylinders would start to fail. Below me, 2 groups of bombers had managed to pull themselves back into 2 tight V formations, while the third group was still scattered and trying to close the gap. I didn't need a clock to tell me how little time remained before they reached their release point. Every second I kept the engine at full power was another second I moved closer to the edge of mechanical failure, but every second also brought me closer to their lead formation. So I shoved the nose down again, feeling the P-40 answer with the strained growl of a machine being pushed past its limits, and prepared myself for another dive, knowing full well that I was gambling everything I had left on one more attack run. I barely had time to catch my breath before the fight swallowed me again. 6 Oscars were already cutting across my path, trying to force me away from the bombers, so I shoved the nose down and let Lulu Bell drop into a hard dive, the airframe shuddering as we hit around 390 miles an hour. They couldn't match that speed, not in a dive that steep, and for a moment I slipped through their line like a stone cutting water. When I levelled out at the bomber's altitude, I caught a sally to my right struggling to stay in formation, and at about 300 yards I fired a short, tight burst. The rounds walked clean across its wing root, and the entire outer panel snapped upward, ripping off as if someone had slapped it with a giant hand. The bomber rolled inverted, tumbled nose down, and vanished into the jungle canopy below. No chutes opened. I pulled up hard, and the strain dragged at my vision, making the world narrow into a grey tunnel. When my sight cleared, my coolant gauge was sitting at 248 degrees Fahrenheit, and the engine felt like it was growling through loose bolts. I could feel the detonation in the cylinders, a kind of knocking vibration through the controls that every pilot recognizes as the first hint of trouble turning into disaster. Before I could even think, 8 more Oscars came down from above like falling knives. I tried to roll left, but the Warhawk answered sluggishly, just slow enough for the first burst of 7.7mm fire to stitch across my right wing. I heard the hits before I saw the damage, fabric tearing, metal popping, and then the sickening slackness in the stick that told me something important had broken. One round had taken out the right aileron control rod. I had control, but only in the loosest sense of the word. It felt like steering a truck with half its steering gear shot away. Another burst walked straight up my fuselage, each impact ringing through the frame, and then I saw a streak of green splash across the inside of my windscreen. It took me a heartbeat to recognize it. Coolant, spraying from a hole punched through the reservoir behind the firewall. Steam burst from the cowling seams, oil pressure dropped, and within seconds the engine fire ignited. A liquid-cooled engine doesn't burn like a radial. First the overheated coolant flashes into vapour, then the flames run forward along the cowling, pulled by the slipstream, searching for the fuel lines. If the fire reaches them, the aircraft turns into a fireball. Standard procedure is simple. Shut down, bail out, save yourself. But I was at 8,000 feet, dropping fast, still 12 miles from friendly ground, and the jungle below hid Japanese patrols that would finish what the Oscars started. So I kept the engine running. I pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the flames. The fire dimmed just enough. I pushed the mixture forward again, and the Allison coughed, sputtered, then held on at maybe 60% power. Ugly, uneven, but alive. The raid was broken, the bombers scattering in 3 directions, the attack on Dingan ruined. But now the fight had changed. The question wasn't how to stop them anymore. It was how to keep myself alive in a burning Warhawk that wanted nothing more than to fall out of the sky. The farther I got from the broken bomber stream, the more I began to feel the true weight of what I was flying. Lulubelle was still in the air, but every sound and vibration told me she was hanging on by threads the manuals never mentioned. I pointed her nose southwest toward Nguli, 43 miles that suddenly felt like a lifetime, and watched my oil pressure needle fall straight to 0. The propeller started windmilling unevenly, shaking like it wanted to come off the shaft, and my airspeed bled down to about 180 miles an hour, barely 60 above stall. 6 Oscars followed at a distance, not firing, just watching, like they were waiting for nature to finish the job. One of them eased up beside me, close enough that I could see the pilot turn his head and motion downward, land, give up, become a prisoner. I ignored him. Then the cockpit began to fill with smoke, not from the engine fire earlier, but from burnt wiring behind the panel where enemy rounds had torn through the electrical bundles. My eyes stung. My throat burned. I slid the canopy open, and the wind tore the smoke away, but it also made it harder to breathe at a steady rhythm. At 4,000 feet, things turned worse fast. The right aileron cable finally snapped. The aileron flopped over like a loose hinge, forcing the wing down and the nose to drop. At the same time, the damaged elevator cable stopped giving any real pitch control. I pulled back with both hands, but the nose barely reacted. The P-40 fell into a dive, 200 miles an hour, 220, 250, altitude dropping through 3,000 feet, then 2,500, then 2,000, the green jungle racing up toward me. That was when a strange, half-forgotten lesson snapped into place. Something an instructor had mentioned years earlier about how damaged control surfaces can behave differently when you fly inverted. Upright, the ruined aileron was forcing the right wing down, and the jammed elevator trim was pushing the nose into the earth. But upside down, both forces would reverse. I didn't have time to admire the idea. At about 1,800 feet, I rolled Lulubelle fully inverted. The instant I flipped, -1G slammed me into my straps, blood rushed to my head, and my vision turned red at the edges. The fuel system, built for positive G loads, sputtered and coughed. The Allison engine nearly quit, but then caught again, rough but alive. And just like the theory promised, the nose began to rise, the dive slowed, and I clawed back to around 1,200 feet. I held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds, airspeed between 140 and 160, inching upward at about 50 feet a minute. Then the fuel flow faltered again, starving the engine, and I had to roll upright. The nose dropped immediately, so I began a rhythm no manual ever taught. Upright to feed fuel, inverted to climb, upright to keep the engine running, inverted to stay alive. Flip, breathe, flip again. Above me, the Oscars watched like men staring at an animal too stubborn to die, and one by one they gave up and turned back toward Burma. By the time their silhouettes vanished, my oil pressure had been at 0 for 9 minutes. The Allison running only on inertia and whatever thin film of metal still separated its parts. But somehow, climbing through 4,000 toward 5, I saw Nguli airfield appear through the haze, still distant, but finally real. By the time I reached the outskirts of Nguli, I knew the fight wasn't finished. Not until the wheels touched concrete, if they ever did. My engine was barely holding together, coughing like an old man in winter, and I could feel the power bleeding away with every second. When I dropped my hand to the gear lever, nothing happened. The hydraulic system on a P-40 lived and died with the engine, and mine was almost gone. If the gear didn't lock before the Allison quit, I'd hit the ground short of the runway with the wheels half down, and that meant fire, metal, and a quick end. I could feel my right hand shaking from the carbon monoxide that had been building in the cockpit, but I forced myself to think clearly. The old-timers back in training had told us about a backup hand pump, 28 strokes for full pressure, but it needed both hands. With the ailerons half dead and the elevator barely answering, letting go of the stick meant the nose would drop and the aircraft would roll right into the jungle. So I unbuckled my lap belt, pulled it free, looped it around the control stick and cinched it tight against the seat frame. It wasn't perfect control, but it held Lulu Bell steady enough for me to take both hands and start pumping. 10 strokes, nothing. 15, nothing. At 23, I felt resistance. At 28, I heard the heavy thump under the cockpit, left gear down, then the right. Drag hit immediately, slowing me from 160 to about 135 mph, and I could feel the aircraft fighting to stay in the air. I had 7 miles to the runway, and my vision was tunnelling at the edges, turning grey like an old TV losing its signal. With the engine barely at 40% power, I didn't have enough hydraulic pressure for the flaps, which meant I'd have to land hot, about 120 mph, gear down, no margin for error. Then, 2 miles from the runway, the Allison finally gave up. The propeller windmilled to a stop, the nose dipped, and suddenly, Lulu Bell was nothing more than a battered glider with bullet holes tearing up her airflow. I knew I wasn't going to make the runway upright, but I remembered something my instructor once said about inverted glides: less drag at certain angles. Nobody expected a pilot to actually try it. I didn't have a choice. I rolled the Warhawk upside down at 800 feet, blood rushing to my forehead, and watched the runway appear in the top of my canopy. The glide stretched just enough. At 200 feet I rolled upright again, fighting the dead aileron on the right and the wounded elevator just to keep the wings level. The touchdown hit like a hammer, 7 Gs straight through the seat. The right gear snapped, the wingtip dug in, and Lulu Bell ground-looped in a spray of sparks, spinning around before sliding to a stop 200 feet down the runway. For 12 seconds I just sat there, breathing smoke and silence, before I unstrapped and climbed onto the wing. Sergeant Martinez met me as I stepped off, and together we walked around what was left of my airplane. 16 holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. Aileron cable gone, hydraulic reservoir punctured, 3 connecting rods welded to the crankshaft, the coolant system destroyed. Lulu Bell would never fly again. But not one bomb fell on Denyon Airfield that morning. 14 C-47s lived. 63 wounded men lived. The hump lived. 3 days later I told the whole story to headquarters, and on January 8, 1944, General Stilwell pinned the Silver Star on my chest. I flew 95 more missions after that, made ace, and retired as a colonel in 1971. And when I look back on December 13th, 1943, I don't remember the fear or the fire as much as the simple truth every old pilot learns. In the end, the steel doesn't save you. The will to keep fighting does.